All right, so I know in discussing CDNs, we threw out the term APIs, right? And we might have heard of that quite a few times, either in this class or in other discussions of information technology. So API, let's define it. So API is a set of rules and protocols that allows different software applications to communicate with each other. It defines how requests and responses should be structured, enabling systems to exchange data and functionality. In AWS, every time you interact with a service, you are actually sending an API request or call. So let me give you an example. Say I'm building an application for travel planning. That's actually something I did for my master's project back when I was getting my degree at Cal Poly Pomona. So in order for my software to provide you with the latest and greatest flight information, right? That's prices, dates, destinations. I had to use an API. I had to find an API because me trying to recreate a flight service, right, from scratch would have taken me months, maybe years, as a lone programmer, right, and at that time still a student. So rather than reinventing the wheel, there are APIs out there that are set up for you to use so that if you do need, for example, flight data, you can request it through the API. And that API is flexible. That means it could be my application that is requesting information from the API. It could also be another application. Somebody, maybe it's Trivago or hotels.com or Google Flights, all these other travel services might be requesting information from that same API. So, in a sense, I'm talking to another app. I'm saying, hey, this flight information app, I need your data. Can you give it to me? And a lot of times when you build an API, you can monetize it, right? So that flight service that's giving me all the information is going to charge me for every single request. You can build free APIs. That's definitely a thing on the internet as well. Or if you're just building a software that has many different components, we've talked about microservices. You can build out APIs for those services to talk to each other in an easier way. With respect to AWS, every time you're requesting a service, every time you launch an EC2 instance, every time you configure auto scaling, every time you set up an S3 bucket, the way you're talking to the AWS system, to the AWS cloud, is through API requests. So you're actually using APIs to communicate. So APIs are like a radio system or a phone system for software to talk to each other. So you can invoke or call these APIs to provision, configure, and manage your AWS resources. So that's what we mean by provisioning. How do you actually get resources, right? How do you actually set them up, configure, launch them? You're actually doing that under the hood with APIs. So there are different ways for you to communicate with the AWS cloud, right? To send those API requests. Probably the most user-friendly one is going to be the management console. So we already use that to launch an EC2 instance. So every time you click the button, you're sending some kind of API request. You're requesting, hey, do this for me, and it responded by, for example, configuring the instance or launching the instance. So management console, definitely the most beginner friendly. You can quickly access recently used services. We saw the search bar. You can search for EC2, S3, text extract, right? If you're trying to extract text, bunch of services, right? Easy to navigate through the management console. You don't have to be an engineer to do it. So the console includes wizards and automated workflows that can simplify the process of completing tasks. You can also perform tasks such as monitoring resources, viewing alarms, and accessing billing information. Definitely, management console really useful for some services, but if you're trying to provision things in a more programmatic way, if you're trying to execute things automatically, the management console isn't the best place to do that. There's another way to send those API requests to ask the AWS cloud to, hey, can you start an instance up? Can you add more instances to my scaling group? If you want to talk to the AWS cloud in a much faster way, in a much more programmatic way, so programmatic means you're probably going to be an engineer to some capacity there, or even IT, right? Specialists can definitely work as CLI. So a CLI, what is it? What am I talking about? CLI is a command line interface. So for example, I'm gonna exit here. This is called a graphical user interface when you're on your Windows operating system or Mac. It's graphical because it has graphics, has little pictures of icons, so I can navigate really easily. But under the hood, there's and actually one of the original interfaces of computers is a command prompt. So rather than clicking, for example, to navigate your files, you would actually use commands. So it's a command line interface. You're interfacing with the computer through a command line rather than through buttons and graphics. So, for example, if I wanted to see which folders are available, or I think I'd have to do dir. So here we can see all the folders in my computer. So we have our documents, downloads, and if I wanted to navigate to that folder, I could do, for example, documents. And there, I'm inside the documents folder. There you go. So I'm using the command line to interface with my computer. Well, you can also use the command line to talk to the AWS cloud, to provision resources, right, and compute through the AWS cloud. So AWS CLI, it's a special tool for command line interfaces that allow users to interact with AWS services directly from the command line. So it enables you to control multiple AWS services directly from the command line with one tool. It's available on Windows, Mac OS, and Linux, the top operating systems. It's much faster than manually clicking through the management console. So that was our previous. So although management console is great for like billing, maybe viewing and setting up alarms, it's not obsolete, right? It's still extremely useful, especially if you're maybe in a smaller organization. But once you're trying to scale up, once you're trying to make things automatic, once you're trying to do things in a more clean cut way, you're definitely going to go command line. And I can tell you, working in a large development team, we did almost everything through the CLI. Of course, right? You're not going to become an expert in this class on the CLI. We're just discussing the different ways on how actual operators, right, might work with AWS Cloud. So yeah, it's faster because you can use scripting. So scripting is you can automate tasks through programming. So if you want to, for example, every day at noon, you want to start up 10 different EC2 instances, you could do it through the management console, but that would take a bit of clicking, right? Quite some time. Or you can do it automatically through a script. A script would run itself. It would tell AWS Cloud to do the exact same thing, and it would do it pretty much instantly. So you can automate the actions that your services and applications perform through scripts, such as launching EC2, just like I said, or configuring scaling. Another option, and this is definitely the hardest way, so CLI, you could be an IT specialist, you could also be an engineer. This one's strictly for engineers. So you got to know your programming, you got to be a software engineer at this point. So this is the highest level of difficulty. This is going to be the software development kits, or SDKs. So these are a set of tools designed for developing software. So different programming languages you might have learned of in other classes or just on the web. There's like Java, right? Java is going to have a SDK. C++ is going to have an SDK. So Amazon provides SDKs so that you can interact with AWS services through an API designed for your particular programming language. So if you're doing JavaScript, there's going to be a SDK for talking to AWS for JavaScript. If you like Java, there's going to be a different SDK for you. So SDKs enable you to use AWS services with your existing applications or create entirely new applications that will run on AWS. So while command line is also, in a sense, right, you're programming, when you're actually building your apps, you can actually talk to AWS directly from your app's code. So that's why this is the hardest one, because not only do you need to know, what services you need when you want to provision them, you also need to know how to use this particular software development kit or programming language. So this is basically you're talking to AWS directly from inside your software's code. So AWS does provide guides and documentation, sample code for each of its supported languages. Those include C++, Java, .NET, and many, many, many more. So go ahead and watch this video, part 2 of how to provision AWS resources, and we'll pick up right after that video.